that was one of the things when I first came to teach at Stanford. Years later, and now is even more true. The students were wearing rags. They just wear rags, and then and now they wear underwear. But it was a completely different thing. You were supposed to look professional, practice looking professional, and get dressed up. You got dressed up every day.
Did you meet any outright hostility in terms of your being a woman in class, either from professors or classmates?
Not really, I must say. Not hostility, but it was a kind of, like, people would say to me, they really would purport to have these serious discussions. I remember a man on the law review. I was going to do this topic for my note on the law review, and I had gotten a really good topic. And then this man, who was a good friend and a liberal man, came and said, I also thought of that topic, and I've done some research on it, and it's more important for me to have this good topic than it is, for you, a mere woman. And he was really serious about it, and I accepted that. I gave him the topic, but I ended up getting a better one anyway. So and then people I would hear, that some men were playing basketball, and they were discussing that all the women in law school were frigid, and the idea of having a law school romance. Nobody had romances. The men wouldn't go out with women in law school, just because they were considered so freakish, and. So it's funny, and then today the law school is a hotbed of romance. It really is. It just is. It's wonderful. I love it, and that's why I love seeing the students get together, especially the women.
You mentioned law review.
Yes.
So you were on law review?
Well, law review was a different thing in those days.
What was it then?
Because you had to. You got on only by grades. You see, that's how people would. So it's like the top 10% of the class was invited to join, or you could write an article, and if it was accepted, then you would be a write-on person for the law review. But that was surprisingly not as prestigious as having gotten on by grades. But then to actually stay on, it was much more rigorous. You had to write a note and get it published. And then if you didn't become an officer of the law review in your third year, if you weren't elected to officership, you had to write a second long piece to stay on the masthead. So if your name was on the masthead of the law review, that was very, very significant. And there had been a handful of women in the whole history of the school up to that point.
Was your name on the masthead?
My name was on the masthead, but I didn't get to be an officer. And at the time, I was really quite crushed, although I blamed myself, because I was never very good at the kind of grunt work, the checking and getting the details right. But I had written this note that was caused a big stir, and was a really great note. And I read it the other day, and it's darn good. I was just amazed. This thing I wrote, it was on
the subject
treble damages in antitrust cases, following a plea of nolo contendere. And it was one of the first white-collar cases in which the government had allowed these people in electrical companies who had raised the rates. See, it all, it seems modern, but it was a long time ago in the 60s. They had allowed them to plead nolo contendere to criminal charges, and the question was, did that have the effect of a guilty plea in a subsequent treble damages suit? So and I said that it did, and wrote up this evidence piece, and I'm just amazed. I mean, there's stuff in there I don't know today, that I knew then, but it caused quite a stir because some people said Yale law students shouldn't be allowed to publish about pending cases, the people who were on the other side of the issue.
Right. Right.
And but when I didn't get to be an officer, I didn't realize at the time, which I realize now, that it really was sex discrimination, and I should have been an officer. It was wrong. But they had a woman a couple of years before, and she didn't work out, so they weren't ready to try another one. So that was my that was one of my experiences with sex discrimination, of which I had many in law school, but I didn't recognize it. I didn't think about it, and when I didn't get to be an officer, I thought it was my fault because I didn't do the site checks thoroughly enough.
Women blaming ourselves for
yes, absolutely.
Our plight.
Yeah.
Clerking is an important part for some people in their legal careers, and you clerked.
Right.
And for whom did you clerk?
Now, I clerked for Judge Henry W. Edgerton, and he was a judge on the Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit. Very prestigious place to clerk. But now remember, I'm graduating. I'm from D.C. I'm graduating certainly in the top 10%. I was ordered a Coit, but around 8th or 9th in my class, and so I'm just assuming that I'm going to go clerk and for one of the famous judges, because the D.C. Circuit then was just an incredible liberal circuit. There was Skelly Wright and David Bazelon and Carl McGowan and Charles Fahey and Spotswood Robinson and just wonderful, wonderful liberal judges that none of them ever had a woman law clerk, see. And I had judges of incandescent liberal credentials wouldn't even think of hiring a woman. And the things that they said were just unbelievable, they didn't want to, they like to tell dirty jokes, or they like to sit around in their shirt sleeves, or they like to work late at night, and, keeping a woman clerk there would cause talk or be inappropriate, and things like that, they said. So but again, see, with my usual attitude, I just thought, well, maybe they've never hired a woman, but they'll hire me, If I can just talk to them, they'll do it. So I applied, and then Alan Dershowitz, who's a famous law professor that will be known to everybody who ever sees or hears this, he was a year ahead of me, and he had in law school, and was my friend, and he had been the editor-in-chief of the Law Review, and so had edited these pieces that I wrote. So he was a fan of mine, and so he called me up. He was clerking for Judge Bazelon. And see, the Judge Bazelon and these other judges, Wright and so forth, were feeder judges to the Supreme Court, where everybody still wanted, where no women, there had been one woman clerked, and she clerked for Justice Douglas during the war, when no men were available, see. Lucille Lohman, who was a very neat woman. But otherwise, no women clerking on the Supreme Court. So Alan called me and he said, listen, all these judges, you've got interviews with all these judges, but they won't hire you. They're not ready to hire a woman. But there's this great old senior judge, and he's hired women before, and he's also hired several black law clerks, which no one had done at that point. And so he said, and I hadn't even thought to apply to a senior judge, because you think, you want to get a young judge who can forward your career and be around in the early stages of it. So I applied to Judge Edgerton, and I went down and I had interviews with everybody on the D.C. circuit. But the first one was with Judge Edgerton, and he was a great-looking man. He was like central casting from a judge. Maybe I'll show you a picture of him later. But he had this, full head of white hair and this great old face, and so we talked for about an hour, and I just felt like I never knew my grandparents and my grandfathers, but I really felt like he was a grandfather. And so at the end of it, he said, well, Barbara Babcock, I'd like to have you for a clerk, if you would like to have it. Now, see, I had all these interviews lined up, and for which I believed I could get with I had a lot of confidence in my charm in those days, and so I just thought I just flashed on it, and I just said, I would like to clerk for you, just without saying, well, would you give me a chance to talk to the others, or I think I'm interested, but I'd like to talk to the others, or anything like that. I just said immediately. So we started off with this great relationship, which is what I tell the students, that because they tend, especially the clerkship race has become such a mess, and they tend to, to do that, to try to juggle. And when, judges will call up and give exploding offers, you take this offer in an hour, or I'm going to move to the next person, and just unseemly. But anyway, the Judge Edgerton, I loved him, and he was a really great old man, and he taught me everything I know about legal writing, which is a lot. And he knew that I was particularly interested in criminal cases. So as a senior judge, he had his choice of sitting on what kind of cases, not particular cases, but what kind of cases. So he just, the year I was there, took only criminal cases. So
you must have been in heaven.
I was in heaven. And then he loaned me out to Judge Bazelon, because Judge Bazelon always had this thing of, he had a good clerk and a bad clerk, and he would decide that one clerk was the bad clerk and no good. And so his bad clerk had been first in his class at Harvard. He couldn't even believe what was happening to him, that he had been designated the bad clerk. But anyway, I worked for Judge Bazelon on criminal cases, and most people today who know me think that I clerked for Judge Bazelon because I worked on so many opinions with him.
You were the good clerk.
I was a good clerk. I was a good outside clerk, so not subject to his difficult temperament.
Where does this affinity for criminal defense come from? Criminal cases?
Well, that's another thing I can't really trace. I think it's another thing that from early on, that's what I wanted to do, is be a criminal defense lawyer, and that was at a time where I don't think there was anybody else in my class at Yale who aspired to that, though there may have been other people who did it. Actually, I don't think there was anybody else who did it in my class in those days. But honestly, I don't know. It was something I was always interested in the underdog, and the idea of using your skills to help the person who is really down, kind of thing. And so that was it. And then, it really is the most interesting area of law, I think, because you're dealing with real human situations, at their most heated. And
so you were able, though, to realize a dream that I guess most people don't, which is you want to do criminal defense work, and you end up creating the public defender's office in Washington, D.C. I mean, it's yours. You created it.
I was there for the formal creation. I have to give credit to people like Barry Bellow, who was one of the precursors of it. But no, and as for actually, and the people that were with me, like Norman Lefstein and a host of other people. Who was my deputy, and Edison Bowman, and a lot of really other people. It wasn't just me, but I was there. I was there at the creation